Douglas Ferguson, the man,
I'm
the
here.
president, the founder, Voltage Control. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time. It's South by. It's very busy. As we were talking earlier, I'd like to get your take for all the entrepreneurs that are at home that are watching this, or all the ones that are going to watch it later. Man, I'm doing South by. What is your slice of life, slice of advice for the person that goes, I'm going to wake up at 8. I'm going to have my breakfast at 9. I'm going to try someplace new. I'll go to Holy Roller, Whole Foods, corporate. But by 10 until 10, I want to have a meeting every hour. Or do you try to break that part of the brain and go, it's chaos. I'm going to run with the chaos. And I call it serendipity. You called it
Collisions.
Yeah.
I'm a big, I love that you brought up chaos because I'm a big fan of complexity theory.
Okay.
And as we're dealing with complex adaptive systems, which South by would be one.
Absolutely.
We have to use tools and methods that work in a complex environment, which would be probing and sense making. And so as the environment continues to change, someone might not show up for that coffee meeting, or the line might be too long for this session you want to get into. And so I would really encourage folks to try to explore new things. Don't be so regimented in your schedule. Sure, there might be things that need to happen. You might have a prospect that's in from out of town. Absolutely hold that meeting and try to work around it. But also just embrace things that might emerge. If you bump into someone that randomly, there can be a lot of benefit from that.
Where do you see in what you guys do? And especially we do talk a little bit off camera about the conference you put on. I'd like to touch back to that, give a little insider baseball for you, because there's a methodology that seems like it follows through from your company. And I'm assuming it follows from the top down. It follows from you to your company and how you want people to respond and react, whether it's at a conference or not, to your partners and sponsors around you and what that looks like. Can you?
Sure, yeah. At the CTO Summit, which is coming up on April 9th, it's a conference, one-day, single track that we put on for CTOs and people that are on that track. So directors and VPs that are, thinking along the same lines. And building technology and the teams that support that technology. And we put these events on to create an environment where people can meet each other and we can create those collisions for people that would never have met. And also we have folks that are sharing 20-minute kind of TED-style talks.
Okay.
And then we also have facilitated networking where folks can get to know each other a little bit better. And we don't relegate the networking to the bathroom breaks. We actually facilitate it. So there'll be conversations that are based off of methodologies and activities that we use with our corporate clients. We bring them into the conference as well. And we also ask our sponsors to come with that mindset, knowing that the environment we're creating, it needs to be a sales-free zone, and it should be about building relationships, not necessarily, trying to create a transaction there in the moment.
Do you see the concept or the idea of, and you've touched on this here, and I'd like to bridge this into what your company does, because it's a little bit backwards but full direction here. Conversation versus pitch.
I love the fact that you're using this word conversation, because a lot of what we do is about designing conversations. So we bring teams together to solve tough problems, and we use methods for integrated decision making, which means that we're going to bring a team together that may have just formed or have never met, because they're the stakeholders that need to take this big project forward, but they're all on different teams, maybe sometimes different companies. And so whenever we're looking at building a conversation, we have to think about where we want that conversation to go and what are the constituent parts that are the milestones that we need to hit along the way. And then we start to think about the methods and activities that might get us there. But ultimately, I would say every conversation starts with an invitation.
Yep.
Because we have to invite someone in. And so, we were talking about this, and this is a much more of just a random encounter kind of conversation versus a very designed conversation. But you can use these conversation design principles in your everyday conversations as well. You brought up this point of, if I just come and throw my title down, and walk, and like, and that's how I describe myself, then it closes the door, right? And we want to really think, especially at the beginning of a conversation, how we create openings.
Yeah.
Right. And we do that by invitations. So we really invite people to think about what we do or get really curious about them and ask probing questions to explore. And so so it really is about just almost using improv techniques to really open up a conversation so
Sure.
it diverges. Now, at some point, we have the equal and opposite challenge, which is how do we close it out?
I know. I mean, we're gonna have that problem at the end.
Yes,
I have
we
that
will.
problem all the time. I love the probing nature. I love the idea of the banter back and forth of sharing stories. I wonder in this, how does all of this go back to? Let's talk about like when you first started your company. How you build a base and an idea, and then take this concept that seems a lot less of, all right, our benchmark is 12 million by Monday, and if we don't do it, I'm going to lose my mind, versus our benchmark is looking at this sector, talking to these people, opening up this chapter, and understanding the impact we can have because we understand and see this world differently, and if they follow our methodology based on a conversation, not based on a pitch, we can change their worlds.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Because that's what I'm feeling as we're talking.
Yeah, for me, it's about human-centered design, and I've applied that to how I build a business.
Okay.
So, we historically, I've been a CTO at startups, and we focused on building software.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm building a company, but I'm using the same methodologies that I use for building software, and just getting really curious about the potential customers and people who might become potential customers, and what trajectory they're on, what problems they're struggling with, and also when I begin to talk to them about what I do, like how they respond to that, and then what stuff did they react negative to. It's really curious to me when someone rejects something,
Mm-hmm.
but I can tell that they need it. And so what is that disconnect, right? Like, and how do I need to change my language, or is it like just their perception? And how do you navigate around that stuff? I found that to be a really fun design challenge.
Do you see, and you talked about this, you're not just looking at the trajectory of your company and the impact you can have, but you're looking at the trajectory of those industries, and either they're super hot and everyone's going after them, or they're growing, and you figured out a way that you can help them grow farther or be greater.
Yeah,
It seems like you're doing just as much research on your company and building and doing what you need to do as much as you're doing it on the other companies that you're going to have a conversation with.
Yeah, and the fascinating thing is the research that I do for my company, for my growth,
Mm-hmm.
benefits my customers, because then I have this holistic view of the situation they're in, which then is a great perspective for them. Because typically, it's not totally ostrich in the sand, but people get in their zone or in their tunnel, and they're just going, right.
Yeah.
And so if you come in with this extra perspective, it can be really valuable. So I found the stuff that I'm doing to enlighten myself as far as how I can navigate the market and help customers helps enlighten them as well.
What industries are piquing your interest these days? What's a couple of things that are on your radar?
I'm really fascinated by serving. It's not so much an industry as it is just a general target, I guess, which is the underserved.
Okay.
So there's a lot of activity on the coasts,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of cities that have, amazing companies that have been around for years. A lot of times they're family run, and they just don't have access to the same resources, and they're desperately at risk of getting run over by Amazon or whoever else is coming along from a big tech and big funding standpoint. And so I'm really interested in serving those communities. In fact,
How would you serve them?
so helping them explore strategically where they can take their company,
Mm-hmm.
so that they don't get disrupted. So
Okay.
basically, innovation strategy.
Okay.
A lot of the work, there's a lot of folks that tackle innovation from the top down, but our approach is a combination of the two. If they've already started programmatic work, with someone else, we augment that from the bottom up.
Okay.
So we're all about how can you empower the doers and the teams that are like figuring the stuff out, help them create durable decisions that last and allow projects to build momentum much faster.
Do you, there's that study that came out, David Hawley at Economy wrote this article, I think almost about a year ago, maybe 9 months ago. 1.4 trillion globally, there's 400 billion nationally here. PE firms have to spend a certain amount of money, right? And they're looking at SaaS companies, and there's a good and a bad to it. And I bring this up because we talk about these smaller places that are, let's say, scale. Let's say they're SaaS, and a PE company looks and goes, all right, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Des Moines, I got this little place over here. I'm going to buy all of those for $100 billion. I'm going to bundle them up. Who's going to Chicago?
Right.
And I understand the idea, and for a moment, you can get those people cash, and hopefully if they have another dream or vision, they can start something else. But I bring it up because I wonder, isn't it counterproductive then to what you're doing and what you're trying to do? And I think what maybe their vision of trying to do is, let's build something that lasts in these flyover states, in these cities, in these areas, that is a staple that our coastal cities have, right? It seems like we're missing those staples. I'm glad you got bought for $50 million. I'm glad you got money. But what happened?
Are they going to reinvest that back into the community?
Yeah.
Or are they moving it to some other city? If we can help those cities become more viable in the long term, that would be an amazing mission to be a part of.
Yeah. And I guess that begs the question, right? If that is afforded to you, do you think you guys can do that?
I'm certainly going to try. That's the vision. We work with a lot of corporates, and I advise a lot of startups, and we're just now starting to try and crack the nut on some of these other, tapping into some of these other cities and see how we can help them out. And ultimately, and you touched on this a second ago, and I just want to come back to it, is this difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I think about innovation, so innovation can be defined in many different ways. One paradigm, one construct that people will use is Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. And so some people will get really stuck in, some companies are doing only Horizon 1, so incremental stuff, optimizing processes. And let's face it, if you're a big company and you do something that's going to impacts the bottom line by 2%, that's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
But it's not the same as developing a Horizon 3 innovation that adds a whole new business unit that unlocks a ton of future value and maybe creates a moat or creates some defensibility around getting just run over by the competition. And so I'm really passionate about creating structures that allow for all sorts of innovation and making sure there's an intentional conversation around what the strategy is so that the doers are empowered to know how we should try to innovate. Because while I believe we shouldn't just be short-sighted in our thinking, some leadership might think that that's the right strategy, and that's fine as long as they communicate it and everyone understands. Rather than just saying we're going to innovate, let's be very crisp on what our strategy is, and that empowers the doers to then go do without having to, gives them autonomy.
Yeah. Do you think in this world, the innovators, there's a communication break to inspire the doers? Where they come in and they've got this idea and it's like, let's go for a hike, and you're like, great, but no one tells you it's Everest.
Right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
We got all the time in the world. Don't worry about it.
The interesting thing about Everest, the story I like to tell is you don't climb Everest. You don't just go, I'm going to climb Everest, right? There's base stations.
Yeah.
And making those milestones into the work you do is super important. There's an awesome book called Moments, The Power of Moments.
Okay.
And they talk about these poignant moments that you might have throughout your life or through your career. And whenever you're striving for a very, very kind of monumental moment, I'm going to be at the top of Everest, you have to create those base stations. So you don't just say, I'm going to learn Spanish. Instead, you say, okay, in order to become, well, the issue is that a lot of people, when they say, I'm going to learn Spanish, they immediately think, oh, I'm going to go become fluent in Spanish. It's the ones that actually get the closest to being there are the ones that set the milestones. So they say, first, I want to be able to ask where the bathroom is. Then I want to be able to read a menu. Then, whatever those steps are, and if you set those steps and you work toward them, then you have those sub moments, those individual moments that you can hold and own. And even if you don't make it past, if you plateau at some point, you can still look back and say, I did all these things. And I think that kind of thinking and that approach is super important for teams and individuals as they explore this big work, because they can't look back and say it was all for naught, because there's going to be a lot of failure. And we have to look at what benefits we did get and what accomplishments we made along the way. And even if it's a win, it takes a lot of tenacity, and a lot of patience and a lot of grit. And so if you're identifying these little wins along the way, then you can own those and kind of get to the big thing. So so that's one thing that popped up on the Everest thing. And then also, there's another thing that people have to be aware of, which is what we're in the biz call the frozen middle.
Okay.
So and this can manifest in a lot of ways. Sometimes executives aren't communicating at all. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they think they're communicating, but it's ineffective. Sometimes they are communicating, and it's just not getting through this frozen middle, right? And the frozen middle are is management. And management is designed by its nature to be operational and focused on efficiency and business as usual and making sure that the train runs on time.
Sure.
And sometimes if we're thinking about big audacious goals, we might need to slow way down. We might have to stop the train one day and just change how the wheels work or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a big challenge when organizations think about how to scale innovation. And so often they're creating groups off to the side so they can go around the frozen middle, but it's a big challenge. And so I think those are the two things that really come to mind when you talk about people being confused. It's like, A, it's not being communicated, or it can't make through that. It hasn't made it through that frozen middle, or it's getting stuck somehow, or it got communicated poorly. We're not being succinct about our goals. It's just like, oh, we're just going to innovate. And it's like, well, okay.
Yeah.
And especially when it's vague and folks just start doing, spray and pray kind of stuff, or just following some passion, it's going to get shot down if it's not aligned with the business objectives. But it's confusing and demoralizing if it hasn't been communicated properly, because you don't really understand why it got shot down. Typically it happens later in the game, and it'd be much better to pre-filter that, right, with some knowledge about what our missions and values are.
So one last question here, and I'll say a little bit the Everest thing. I heard this guy say this: the danger of Everest, the danger of the Amazon. On Everest, you're at the highest point of the earth. You can see everything. You've achieved the highest point, but there's zero growth. There's nothing up there. It's dead. In the Amazon, you can get to the lowest point to where the growth is so overwhelming you can't see the sun and it's dark. As an entrepreneur, as someone who's worked at startups and now has your own, what's your advice for someone that thinks that Everest is the place to be, based on this analogy, and also for the person who's in the Amazon and is looking at all this growth, and maybe it's that person in middle America who's just, the Amazons and everyone around them is blocked out the sun.
Yeah.
And they just want to get in those beautiful wheat fields of Nebraska where there's a perfect amount of growth and there's a perfect amount of vision.
Yeah, there's something to be said about, moderation.
How dare you?
Anything done in moderation, And so I think that's a very pleasant thing to think about. And I like to go, for me, I'm real interested in going places where, it's not it's not necessarily the red ocean.
Yeah.
But it's not the desert, it's like, where is there an interesting opportunity where let's get out of the echo chamber and go to a conference where people aren't talking about this stuff and I can talk about it. And then I can also learn from them because they're thinking totally different than all these other folks. And so that's one of my my favorite pieces of advice to any of my mentors is to go to a conference completely out of your industry because you'll learn some amazing stuff. And I'll also flip your analogy on its head a little bit and say, because you were talking about extremes.
Yeah.
Right? Extreme growth and extreme death and lack of growth. And opportunity always lies in extremes. Mm-hmm. Now you were talking about like extreme markets, right? And so, that might be something to avoid, but in your problem space and in the work you do, always explore the extremes. And you may not want to stay there. You may not want to operate there, but go see what's happening there because that's where you can learn a lot.
Yeah. I said that was the last question. We'll close with this. Sorry to everyone. It's like, I'll tell people this. There's more times than not you're talking about the same thing. You're just seeing it differently. So I like you going to different conferences. Look at a dollar bill, hold it up to someone and say, explain this to me. And then you explain your side, and they're totally opposite. But the barrier between those oppositions is literally paper thin.
Yeah.
And we'll wrap it back to what you talked about earlier of someone saying no, but you've got the answer and you know they need it. How do you show them that the difference really is paper thin there and you're on the same side? It's just viewed differently.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to, well, for me personally, the tools that work best come from human-centered design.
Yep.
And so it's all about reframing the problem. And it's assuming the person's patient enough, to be with you through this process, getting really curious and trying to really understand their mindset and where they're coming from. And this is especially challenging when someone has different political views than you or different moral, like the things they're saying seem to conflict with your morals in some way. And I think that's the best place to practice this type of stuff because it's the most difficult. And so if you can master it in those kinds of conversations, you can apply them to any kind of conversation.
Beautiful. Thanks for the time, man.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it.